In the deepest halls of every Space Marine Fortress monastery, far below the training grounds where neophytes first learn to wield a bolter, far beneath the chapels where battle brothers gather for prayer, there exist chambers that most of the chapter will never enter. These are places of absolute reverence and profound silence, lit only by the faint glow of stasis fields and the dim lumens of maintenance servitors. The air here tastes of sacred oils and incense, thick with the weight of millennia. And in these halls stand the sarcophagi, towering forms of ancient ceramite and adamantium, each one containing something more precious and more terrible than any relic blade or fragment of the Emperor's own armor. Within these armored tombs sleep warriors who walked when the Imperium was young. They fought beside primarchs whose names are now legend, witnessed the galaxy ablaze with the fires of the Horus Heresy, and saw with their own eyes the moment when humanity's brightest dream became its darkest nightmare. They are dreadnoughts, the honored ancients, the undying witnesses to an age that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to forget, to rewrite, to transform into myth and propaganda. And when these ancient warriors wake, when their mechanical voices crackle to life, after decades or centuries of dreamless sleep, they speak of things that no living soul in the 41st millennium was meant to know. The mere existence of these ancient warriors presents a profound paradox for the Imperium of man. They are revered as living relics, honored as embodiments of the chapter's history and martial prowess, consulted as sources of tactical wisdom accumulated over millennia of warfare. Yet they are also dangerous, for they remember. They remember a time before the imperial creed, before the ecclesiarchy declared the emperor a god, before 10,000 years of dogma and lies reshaped the truth of what happened during humanity's greatest civil war. They remember the primarchs not as demigods and saints, but as brothers and warriors, flawed and proud and all too human in their ambitions. They remember the emperor not as the divine master of mankind, but as a man, impossibly powerful and terrifyingly brilliant, but still a man, with a man's capacity for miscalculation and hubris. These witnesses to the heresy carry within their scarred minds a version of history that contradicts almost everything the modern Imperium believes about itself. They know that the traitor primarchs did not fall purely to the corrupting influence of chaos, but were driven to rebellion by legitimate grievances, by the emperor's own mistakes, by resentments that festered for decades before finally erupting into open war. They know that many of the rituals and beliefs that define the Imperium in the 41st millennium would have been considered rank heresy during the Great Crusade, when the imperial truth preached reason and science over superstition and faith. They know things about the nature of the warp, about the Emperor's secret projects, about the true relationship between the Space Marine legions and their primarchs, that could shake the foundations of the Imperium if widely known. And so, when these ancient warriors wake, their words are heard by only a select few. Chapter masters consult them in private, behind sealed doors where no servitor or serf might overhear. Chaplains record their testimonies in cipher, in codes known only to the highest echelons of the chapter hierarchy. What these ancients say is weighed carefully, filtered, contextualized through 10,000 years of institutional memory and political necessity. Because the truth these warriors carry is not always convenient, not always useful, and sometimes actively dangerous to the carefully constructed myths that hold the Imperium together. This is the story of what happens when a dreadnought, who witnessed the Horus Heresy, finally speaks. It is a story about memory and madness, about the weight of 10,000 years of existence, about the terrible burden of being the last living link to an age when the galaxy burned. It is a story about what the Imperium has forgotten, what it has chosen to forget, and what secrets are locked away in the armored tombs of warriors who can never truly die. The living tomb. What it means to be a dreadnought. Before we can understand what happens when a heresy-era dreadnought speaks, we must first comprehend what it means to exist as one of these undying warriors, to be sealed within a walking tomb of ceramite and steel, to trade mortality for an eternity of service that is both the highest honor a Space Marine can receive and a fate that some would consider worse than death. The creation of a Dreadnought begins with catastrophic injury. Not the kind of wound that can be repaired with bionics and surgery, not the loss of a limb or even multiple limbs, but injuries so severe that the Space Marine's enhanced physiology, remarkable as it is, cannot sustain life. Imagine a warrior crushed beneath the rubble of a collapsing fortress, his spine shattered in 3 places, his legs destroyed beyond any hope of reconstruction, his internal organs ruptured and failing. Imagine a champion struck down by a Chaos Demon's blade, his body corrupted at the cellular level by energies that no amount of surgery can excise. Imagine a captain torn apart by an enemy Dreadnought's power fist, his torso barely intact, his nervous system traumatized beyond repair. In any other circumstance, such warriors would receive the Emperor's peace, a merciful bolt to the brain that would release their gene seed for implantation in the next generation of Space Marines. Death with honor, remembered in the chapter's halls of heroes, their names carved in stone and their deeds sung by the chapter's chroniclers. For most Space Marines, this is how their story ends, and they welcome it. Death in service to the Emperor, death in the defense of humanity is the ultimate expression of their purpose. But for a rare few, those whose deeds have marked them as truly exceptional, those whose tactical wisdom or combat prowess are deemed too valuable to lose, the apothecaries make a different choice. Instead of death, they offer a kind of immortality. The dying Space Marine is stabilized, placed into a state of suspended animation while the chapter's tech Marines prepare the sarcophagus that will become his new body. His ruined flesh is stripped away, piece by piece, until only the essential remains: a torso, perhaps fragments of limbs, the vital organs, and most importantly, the brain and nervous system. What's left of his body is then immersed in a thick, oily amniotic fluid that will sustain his remaining tissues for as long as the life support systems continue to function. The neural connectors are the worst part, according to the few accounts that exist of the process. Imagine having your consciousness directly wired into a machine, your every thought translated into mechanical impulse, your senses replaced entirely by Auspex arrays and targeting systems. The pain of this neural integration is said to be beyond human comprehension, even for a Space Marine with all his genetic enhancements and mental conditioning. Some don't survive the procedure, their hearts simply stopping from the shock despite all the drugs and life support. Those who do survive emerge forever changed, their perception of reality fundamentally altered. A Dreadnought no longer sees through human eyes. He perceives the world through optical sensors and thermal imaging, through motion trackers and targeting reticules. Sound comes to him as data, wavelengths and frequencies, rather than the organic experience of hearing. Touch is pressure readings on armor plating, temperature fluctuations in the hydraulics. The amniotic fluid in which his body floats is numbingly cold, and he cannot feel his own flesh, cannot move limbs that no longer exist. If he allows his consciousness to drift, if he stops actively engaging with the machine systems, his awareness returns to the sensation of his ruined body, and the pain of his injuries returns in full measure. So he must stay focused, must keep his mind merged with the machine, must think of himself not as a body in a shell, but as the shell itself. The Dreadnought becomes his body, the assault cannons his arms, the ceramite armor his skin. This mental discipline is exhausting, a constant effort of will that must be maintained every moment he is awake. And over time, over the decades and centuries, this effort takes its toll. The line between the warrior and the machine begins to blur. Memories of his original body fade. The sensation of walking on human legs, of holding a bolter in human hands, of feeling the wind on his face. All these experiences become distant and unreal, like dreams half remembered upon waking. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. Space Marines are already far removed from baseline humanity, their bodies transformed by genetic engineering, their minds conditioned by hypnotic indoctrination, and psycho-conditioning. They are warrior monks, super soldiers, designed for one purpose and one purpose only. But even with all these modifications, they are still, in some fundamental sense, human. They have brotherhood, camaraderie, the bonds of shared purpose and shared suffering. They understand themselves as warriors among warriors, protectors of humanity's future. A Dreadnought loses much of this. The other Space Marines in his chapter revere him, certainly. They approach him with respect, bordering on worship, seeking his counsel, requesting his blessing before battle. But they do not see him as one of them anymore. He is something else now, something ancient and terrible, a relic from another age. He cannot share a meal with his battle brothers, cannot clasp hands in the warrior's grip, cannot join them in the training cages or the meditation chambers. He exists apart, isolated within his armored shell, a consciousness trapped in a prison of his own flesh and metal. And so, to preserve what remains of their sanity, to prevent the complete dissolution of their identity into the machine, Dreadnoughts are placed in stasis between deployments. Their power systems are cycled down, their consciousness allowed to drift into a state that resembles sleep, but is not truly sleep. For there are no dreams in the darkness of the sarcophagus. There is only absence, a void of non-being that might last for days or decades or centuries. When they wake, they have no sense of how much time has passed. Hours or years, it all feels the same, a sudden jolt from nothingness, back into the overwhelming flood of sensation that comes with activation. This cycle of waking and sleeping, of decades spent in the void, followed by brief periods of activity, creates its own peculiar horror. Imagine waking after what feels like minutes to discover that 50 years have passed. The chapter master who ordered you into stasis is long dead. The battle brothers you fought beside are scattered across the galaxy or honored in the halls of the fallen. The fortress monastery has been expanded and rebuilt. Passages you remember are gone, replaced by new construction. Even the language has shifted, slang and idioms you knew, replaced by new phrases you don't understand. You are a stranger in your own home, a ghost from an earlier age, and everyone who knew you as more than a name in the chapter's records is dust and memory. Now imagine this happening not once, but dozens of times, hundreds of times. Each awakening brings the same shock, the same disorientation, the same crushing realization that time has moved on without you. The faces change, but the rituals remain. The chapter endures, but the individuals who compose it are different with each waking. And you remain, constant and unchanging, a fixed point in a galaxy that continues to evolve around you. For a Dreadnought who has survived for millennia, who has witnessed the rise and fall of entire dynasties of chapter masters, who has fought in wars whose causes are now forgotten, the sense of disconnection from the present becomes overwhelming. The modern Imperium is not the Imperium he remembers. The chapter is not the legion it once was. The very purpose and meaning of service to the Emperor has been transformed by 10,000 years of theological evolution and institutional drift. And yet he continues, because that is all he can do. Continue to serve, continue to fight, continue to endure, until finally some enemy's weapon penetrates the armor and brings the mercy of true death. This is the existence of every Dreadnought, and it is a burden heavy beyond measure. But for those ancient few who were interred during or shortly after the Horus Heresy, who carry within their scarred minds the direct experience of that terrible war, the burden is heavier still. Because they remember not just a different time, but a fundamentally different universe. They remember when the galaxy was being united under the banner of the Great Crusade, when the Primarchs walked among their legions, when the Emperor himself strode the battlefields of 1,000 worlds. They remember the moment when all of it came crashing down, when brother turned on brother, and the dream of a unified humanity died in fire and betrayal. And when these ancient warriors speak, their words carry a weight that transcends mere tactical advice or historical recollection. They speak of a truth that the modern Imperium has spent 10 millennia trying to bury, to forget, to transform into comfortable myth. They speak of the Heresy not as ancient history, but as lived experience, raw and immediate and devastating in its implications. The Horus Heresy. What the ancients remember. To understand the significance of a Heresy-era Dreadnought's testimony, we must first understand what he witnessed, what he experienced firsthand, what he carries locked within his mechanical tomb. The Horus Heresy was not simply a rebellion, not just another civil war in the long and bloody history of human civilization. It was the moment when the Imperium's greatest dream transformed into its darkest nightmare, when the Emperor's vision of a unified, rational, enlightened humanity, free from the tyranny of superstition and alien domination, was shattered beyond repair. The heresy began, as most catastrophes do, with the best of intentions and the most human of emotions. Pride, ambition, the gnawing sense of betrayal that festers when one believes they have been cast aside by someone they love. Horus Lupercal, greatest of the Primarchs, the war master chosen by the Emperor to lead the Great Crusade, while he returned to Terra for mysterious projects in the bowels of the Imperial Palace, came to believe that his father had abandoned him, that after centuries of conquest, after bringing world after world into compliance, after literally shaping the future of the galaxy through his tactical brilliance and charisma, he had been discarded, left to finish his father's work while the Emperor claimed all the glory for himself. The Chaos Gods, those ancient malevolent intelligences that dwell in the warp, saw this resentment and exploited it with terrible efficiency. They showed Horus visions of a future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, where the Primarchs were forgotten or remembered only as myths and legends, where all their sacrifices and achievements counted for nothing. They whispered to him that the Emperor had used the Primarchs as tools, weapons to conquer the galaxy, to be discarded once their purpose was fulfilled. They promised him power, recognition, the throne of Terra itself, if he would only turn against his father and claim what was rightfully his. And Horus, wounded by what he perceived as the Emperor's betrayal, listening to the poisoned counsel of Erebus of the Word-Bearers, broke. His turn to chaos was not instantaneous, not a sudden moment of corruption. It was a gradual slide, a series of choices and compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time, each one taking him further from the light of the Emperor's vision until finally there was no way back. He was committed to rebellion, and he would take half the Imperium with him into damnation. A Dreadnought who lived through the opening moves of the Heresy would remember the confusion, the absolute disbelief when the first reports came through. The Lunar Wolves, renamed the Sons of Horus, had turned traitor. The Death Guard, the Emperor's children, the World Eaters, all betraying their oaths to the Emperor. It was impossible, unthinkable. These were the Space Marine Legions, the finest warriors humanity had ever produced, led by demigods who had fought at the Emperor's side for 2 centuries. How could they turn traitor? But the reports kept coming, and with them, the horror. The virus bombing of Istvan III, where Horus purged his own legion of those he deemed insufficiently loyal, killing tens of thousands of Space Marines who would not follow him into treachery. The drop site massacre at Istvan V, where 7 loyalist legions deployed to crush the rebellion, only to discover that 4 of those legions, the Iron Warriors, the Night Lords, the Word-Bearers, and the Alpha Legion, were traitors as well. The trap was sprung, and the loyalist forces were slaughtered, cut down by those they thought were allies. The Iron Hands, the Raven Guard, and the Salamanders were devastated, their Primarch Ferrus Manus killed in single combat by his former friend Fulgrim. A warrior who fought at Istvan would remember the moment of betrayal, the sick realization as the guns that should have been targeting the traitors instead opened fire on the loyalists. He would remember the screams over the Vox channels, the desperate calls for support that would never come, the sight of battle brothers gunned down by those who had fought beside them only days before. He would remember the feeling of the galaxy tilting beneath his feet, the fundamental certainty of his existence, that Space Marines stood united in service to the Emperor, shattered in an instant. The war that followed would be etched into his memory in fire and blood. The burning of Prospero, where the Space Wolves, following what they believed were the Emperor's orders, destroyed the Thousand Suns' home world in a catastrophic assault that would drive Magnus the Red and his legion into the arms of chaos. The Shadow Crusade, where the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters rampaged through the Ultramar sector, bringing fire and damnation to 500 worlds. The betrayal at Calth, where the Word-Bearers attempted to destroy the Ultramarines in a surprise attack that would leave scars on that system for 10,000 years. But perhaps most traumatic of all would be the memories of the Siege of Terra itself, when Horus brought his full might to bear on the throne world, when the traitor legions and their demonic allies assaulted the walls of the Imperial Palace in what would be the final confrontation of the war. A Dreadnought who fought in the siege would remember battles that lasted for weeks without pause, his weapons growing hot from continuous fire, his ammunition stores depleted and replenished a dozen times, the bodies of friend and foe alike piling up until they formed new terrain features on the battlefield. He would remember the moment when the walls finally fell, when the traitors breached the Eternity Wall spaceport and began their push toward the inner palace. He would remember fighting on ground that had been holy to humanity for 30,000 years, the cradle of human civilization transformed into a charnel house, an abattoir where millions died for every meter of ground. He would remember the sky itself turning red with the reflection of the fires below, the stench of burning promethium and roasting flesh so thick it could be tasted even through a sealed helmet's rebreather. And if he was among those who fought in the final days, he would remember the moment when Horus lowered the void shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, inviting the Emperor to teleport aboard for a final confrontation. He would remember the psychic shockwave that rolled across the battlefield when Horus finally fell, when the Emperor struck him down with the full force of his psychic might, obliterating not just Horus's body, but his very soul, burning it from existence so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not resurrect their champion. He would remember the terrible silence that followed, the moment when the traitor forces, suddenly leaderless and abandoned by their demonic allies, broke and fled, streaming away from Terra in complete disarray. He would remember the dawn that broke over the Imperial Palace, revealing the true scope of the devastation, the millions of dead, the fortress walls reduced to rubble, the very land itself poisoned and corrupted by the touch of chaos. He would remember the sense, not of victory, but of catastrophe barely averted, of a civilization that had destroyed itself even in the act of preserving its existence. These are the memories that a Heresy-era Dreadnought carries, and they are not abstract historical knowledge or dry facts learned from records and chronicles. They are lived experiences, seared into his consciousness with an immediacy that 10,000 years of sleep cannot erase. When he speaks of the Heresy, he does not recount the official version taught in the Schola Progenium, the sanitized narrative that paints the traitor Primarchs as corrupted monsters who fell instantly to the seductions of chaos. He remembers the truth, that these were once warriors of unmatched valor and honor, that their fall was neither instant nor inevitable, that the Emperor himself bore some responsibility for the conditions that allowed the heresy to occur. This truth is dangerous. It complicates the simple narrative that the modern Imperium requires to maintain its stability. It raises questions about the Emperor's judgment, about whether the current theological framework that worships him as a god would have been acceptable to the man who walked among his legions during the Great Crusade. It forces an acknowledgement that the Imperium's enemies were once its greatest heroes, that the line between loyalty and betrayal was not always as clear as modern doctrine suggests. And so, When a Heresy-era Dreadnought speaks, his words are carefully controlled, carefully contextualized, carefully filtered through the institutional needs of the chapter and the Imperium as a whole, because the raw, unfiltered truth of what he witnessed could shake the very foundations of everything the Imperium has become. The long sleep, 10,000 years between waking time, does not pass normally for a Dreadnought. While the rest of the galaxy ages, empires rise and fall, languages evolve, and technologies are lost and rediscovered, he exists in a state of suspended animation, his consciousness cycling through periods of activity measured in days or weeks, followed by decades or centuries of dreamless void. This disrupted perception of time creates a unique form of psychological trauma, a disjointed existence where the warrior experiences only fragments of history, waking for brief moments to fight and then returning to the darkness, each awakening bringing him further from the age he knew and closer to a future he barely recognizes. For a space marine interred during or shortly after the Horus Heresy, the effect is even more profound. When he first entered the sarcophagus, the Imperium was still reeling from the Civil War. The legions were being broken down into chapters during the Second Founding. The Emperor had just been installed upon the Golden Throne, and the survivors of the war were still trying to make sense of what had happened. The memory of the heresy was fresh, painful, immediate. The fallen Primarchs were not distant legends, but brothers and commanders the Loyalists had known personally, whose betrayals still burned with the heat of recent wounds. Now imagine sleeping through what comes next. You close your eyes on an Imperium that is fractured but recognizable, that still holds to the imperial truth, that understands itself as a secular empire of reason and enlightenment. You wake, perhaps decades later, perhaps a century, and the changes are subtle but noticeable. The language has shifted, the rituals have evolved. There are new traditions you don't recognize, new prayers being offered before battle. But it's still fundamentally the same Imperium, still fighting the same fight against the same enemies. You sleep again, and this time when you wake, more has changed. The survivors of the heresy are mostly gone now, replaced by new generations of space marines who know the Great Civil War only as history, as stories told by those who were there. The Imperium has begun to rebuild, to consolidate, to adapt to the new reality of its existence. Superstition is creeping back into human culture, despite the Emperor's vision of a rational, enlightened humanity. The seeds of what will become the ecclesiarchy are beginning to germinate, though they have not yet grown into the vast theological apparatus that will dominate the Imperium's future. You sleep again, waking perhaps 2 or 3 centuries after your interment. The changes are more dramatic now. The Imperium has reorganized itself, the loose confederation of the Great Crusade era transforming into a rigid, hierarchical structure. The imperial cult is growing in influence, though the very idea of worshipping the Emperor as a god would still be considered blasphemy by those who remember his actual teachings. The Space Marine chapters have developed their own distinct cultures and traditions, drifting away from the unified legion structure that defined the Great Crusade. Sleep, wake, sleep, wake. Each time the interval between awakenings grows longer as the chapter recognizes that the Ancient One's knowledge becomes less immediately relevant with each passing century. Each time the shock of waking grows more disorienting as the accumulated changes become harder to pass, harder to integrate into a coherent understanding of how the Imperium has evolved. Wake after 1,000 years, and the Imperium is almost unrecognizable. The imperial truth has been completely discarded, replaced by the imperial creed that declares the Emperor a god and humanity's only salvation. The ecclesiarchy has become one of the most powerful institutions in the Imperium. Its cardinals and confessors wielding influence that rivals and sometimes exceeds that of planetary governors and system lords. The Space Marine chapters are no longer simply military organizations, but quasi-religious orders. their battle. Brothers, as much warrior monks as soldiers, their rituals and traditions elevated to sacred status. The technology has regressed in many ways. Standard template. Construct systems that were commonplace during the Great Crusade are now lost artifacts, their principles forgotten, their operation maintained only through ritual and rote repetition, rather than genuine understanding. The Adeptus Mechanicus has transformed from an organization of scientists and engineers into a priesthood of machine worship, where every repair is a prayer and every activation a sacrament. Knowledge that was freely shared during the Crusade is now hoarded, encoded in mysteries and dogma, accessible only to the initiated. And the wars continue, but their nature has changed. The enemies are the same: traitor space marines, chaos cultists, alien invaders. But the Imperium's response has become more desperate, more brutal, more willing to sacrifice entire worlds rather than risk potential contamination. The optimism of the Great Crusade, the sense that humanity was on the verge of reclaiming its birthright as masters of the galaxy, has been replaced by a grim determination to simply survive, to hold the line against endless enemies, to maintain what remains rather than dream of expansion and growth. Wake after 5,000 years, and even your own chapter has transformed beyond recognition. The fortress monastery has been rebuilt multiple times, each reconstruction layering new architecture over old foundations, until the original structure is buried beneath millennia of additions and modifications. The chapter's traditions have calcified into rigid dogma, practices that began as practical solutions to specific problems, now elevated to sacred rituals that must be performed exactly as written, lest the chapter's honor be compromised. The very language spoken in the halls has evolved, new words and phrases replacing the old, until the dialect you learned during the Great Crusade sounds archaic and formal to modern ears. Wake, after 10,000 years, as Bjorn the Fell-Handed does with each new generation of space wolves, and you are a living fossil, the last remnant of an age that might as well be mythology to those who wake you. The space marines who gather around your sarcophagus to hear your words have never known anything but the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. They have been raised in a culture of endless war, taught from childhood that the Emperor is a god, that suffering and sacrifice are the highest virtues, that hope for anything beyond survival is foolish optimism. The very concepts that defined the Great Crusade, reason, progress, human unity, are foreign to them, replaced by faith, tradition, and acceptance of humanity's diminished state. And yet, when they ask you to speak of the old days, to recount the wars of the Horus Heresy, to tell them what it was like to fight beside the Primarchs and to serve under the Emperor's direct command, what can you tell them? How do you explain a worldview so fundamentally different from their own that it might as well be alien? How do you describe the Great Crusade's optimism, its sense of building something permanent and glorious, when they have been taught that the Imperium's only purpose is to endure, to survive another day in a galaxy that wants nothing more than to destroy them? This is the peculiar torture of the ancient Dreadnought. Not just the physical suffering of existence in the sarcophagus, not just the psychological burden of 10,000 years of scattered consciousness, but the existential horror of outliving his own world, of becoming a stranger in a civilization he helped to build. He is a living bridge between two ages, the Imperium that was and the Imperium that is, and the gulf between them is so vast that sometimes he wonders if they can even be considered the same civilization. Some dreadnoughts cope with this dislocation by retreating into the past, living more and more in their memories of the Great Crusade and the Heresy, treating their periodic awakenings as brief intrusions into a dream rather than returns to reality. They engage mechanically with the battles they're deployed in, following orders, destroying the enemy, fulfilling their function as weapons of war, but their consciousness remains focused on another time, another war, another galaxy. They are ghosts, present in body, but absent in spirit, their minds dwelling in an age that can never return. Others attempt to adapt, to learn the customs and beliefs of the modern Imperium, to understand how their chapter has evolved and find their place in this strange new world. But this adaptation comes at a cost. To truly integrate into the 41st millennium, they must accept that much of what they fought for during the Great Crusade has been lost or perverted beyond recognition. They must make peace with the fact that the Imperium's transformation from rational empire to theocratic nightmare is permanent, that there is no going back to the vision the Emperor originally championed. They must learn to value what the Imperium has become rather than mourn what it might have been. And a few, the strongest or perhaps the most stubborn, refuse either retreat or adaptation. They remain fully present, fully engaged, carrying their memories of the past as precious treasures that must not be forgotten, even as they operate within the reality of the present. These are the ones whose testimony is most valuable and most dangerous, because they can draw direct comparisons between the Imperium that was and the Imperium that is, can identify where the modern institution has strayed from the Emperor's original vision, can speak uncomfortable truths about how far humanity has fallen from the ideals that drove the Great Crusade. These are the ones whose words, when they finally speak, can change the course of their chapter's history, can challenge long-held assumptions, can force a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. And these are the ones whose testimony is most carefully controlled, most heavily filtered, most zealously guarded by those who understand the danger of allowing their full truth to be heard by the wider Imperium. The awakening, protocols and rituals. The process of waking a Dreadnought, particularly one of the ancient few who dates from the Heresy era, is never undertaken lightly. It is a sacred ritual, governed by elaborate protocols and wrapped in layers of ceremony that serve multiple purposes beyond the merely functional. These awakening rites are part technical procedure, part religious sacrament, and part psychological preparation, designed to ease the ancient warrior's transition from the void of suspended animation back into the overwhelming reality of consciousness, and to remind him of his purpose, his loyalty, and his place within the chapter's hierarchy. In most chapters, only the chapter master himself has the authority to order the awakening of a venerable Dreadnought who dates from the Heresy. The decision is never made capriciously, never in response to a minor threat or a routine deployment. These ancient ones are reserved for moments of true crisis, when the chapter faces an enemy that threatens its very existence, when their accumulated wisdom and combat experience become absolutely necessary, or, more subtly, when the chapter leadership requires counsel on matters of such sensitivity that only one who remembers the age before the current orthodoxy can provide appropriate perspective. The awakening begins in the deepest vaults of the fortress monastery, in chambers that are more shrine than armory, where the Dreadnought has stood in silent vigil for decades or centuries. Tech Marines approach the sleeping giant with reverence, their movements slow and deliberate, their prayers to the Omnissiah spoken in whispers that echo through the vault's acoustics. They anoint the sarcophagus with sacred oils, trace protective sigils on its armor plating, light incense burners that fill the chamber with thick, pungent smoke. These actions serve both practical and symbolic purposes, preparing the ancient machine for reactivation while also establishing the ritual context for what is about to occur. The chaplain's role in the awakening is crucial. While the Tech Marines handle the mechanical aspects of bringing the Dreadnought systems back online, it is the chaplain who speaks to the consciousness within, who provides the spiritual framework for the return to awareness. He stands before the sarcophagus, skull helm gleaming in the vault's dim light, and recites the Litany of Awakening, a prayer that is different for each chapter but always serves the same function, to remind the Ancient One of who he is, what he serves, and why he continues to fight. For a Heresy-era Dreadnought, this chaplain's prayer often includes specific reminders of the chapter's history, of battles fought during the Great Crusade and the Heresy, anchoring the ancient warrior's consciousness in a continuity that stretches back to the founding. These references serve a dual purpose. They help orient the Dreadnought, providing familiar touchstones that ease the shock of waking. But they also serve as subtle reminders of the chapter's orthodox interpretation of that history, framing the past in terms that align with current doctrine rather than allowing the Ancient One to impose his own understanding of events. The physical awakening itself is a gradual process. Power flows back into dormant systems, cycling through circuits that have been cold for decades. The amniotic fluid in the sarcophagus warms, life support systems humming back to life, delivering nutrients and stimulants to the withered flesh that remains of the warrior's body. Neural connectors fire, sending impulses through pathways that have been silent, reconnecting the consciousness to the mechanical frame that serves as its body. Sensors come online one by one, optical systems activating, aural receivers beginning to process sound, motion detectors and targeting arrays running diagnostic routines. But consciousness does not return instantly. There is a period, sometimes lasting hours, when the Dreadnought exists in a liminal state, neither fully asleep nor truly awake, his awareness drifting through layers of memory and sensation as his mind reconnects with the machine. During this time, he may speak, his vocalizer stuttering to life to voice fragments of recollection, names of battles long finished, the voices of warriors long dead, echoes of the past bleeding into the present. The chaplain and tech marines who attend the awakening listen to these utterances carefully, for they can provide insight into the Ancient One's mental state, revealing what memories dominate his consciousness, what traumas may have resurfaced during his long sleep. Finally, true consciousness returns, and with it, the terrible shock of existence. Imagine being torn from nothingness back into being, from the peaceful void of non-awareness, into the overwhelming flood of sensation that comes with the Dreadnought's mechanical senses. Every input is immediate and intense, targeting data, thermal readings, structural integrity reports, ammunition counts, all of it hitting the consciousness simultaneously in a cascade of information that must be processed and integrated. And with awareness comes disorientation. How long has it been? Days, years, centuries? The Dreadnought has no internal sense of time passed during his sleep, no way to gauge the interval except by external clues. He must ask, and the answer, when it comes, is often shocking. 50 years since your last awakening, Ancient One. A century and more, honored ancestor. The last time you walked, the chapter master was someone else entirely. All your old battle brothers have passed to the Emperor's side. This moment of disorientation is carefully managed by the chaplain, who provides context, explains what has changed, brings the ancient warrior up to date on the current state of the chapter and the Imperium. But this briefing is selective, emphasizing information that is immediately relevant while downplaying or omitting details that might be troubling or contradictory to chapter doctrine. The chaplain is not simply providing facts, he is constructing a narrative, shaping the Ancient One's understanding of the present in ways that serve the chapter's interests. For Heresy-era Dreadnoughts, this briefing often includes specific assurances about the continued strength of the chapter, about victories achieved during his sleep, about the preservation of traditions he would recognize from his own time of service. These assurances serve to anchor him psychologically, to provide continuity between the age he remembers and the present in which he now finds himself. But they also serve to forestall questions that might arise about how much has changed, about how far the chapter and the Imperium have drifted from the principles that guided them during the Great Crusade. The awakening concludes with a statement of purpose, the chaplain explaining why the Ancient One has been roused from his slumber. A great enemy threatens the chapter, honored ancestor. The orcs mass at our borders in numbers not seen for 1,000 years. A demon prince of the ruinous powers has manifested on the world we defend. We face traitor marines who bear the colors of those who betrayed us at Istvan. Your wisdom and your wrath are needed once more. This statement serves multiple functions. It provides the Dreadnought with immediate focus. channeling his consciousness toward a concrete objective, which helps to manage the disorientation of waking. It reminds him of his purpose, his function as a weapon in service to the chapter and the Emperor, and it establishes clear boundaries for his participation in chapter affairs. He has been awakened for a specific mission, and once that mission is complete, he will be returned to sleep. There is no expectation that he will involve himself in the chapter's broader governance or question the decisions of the current leadership. But of course, things are rarely so simple. A Heresy-era Dreadnought does not wake as an obedient weapon, ready to be pointed at an enemy and deployed without question. He wakes with 10,000 years of experience, with direct memories of the Emperor and the Primarchs, with knowledge of battles and strategies that predate the chapter's very existence. He has earned the right to question, to offer counsel, to speak his mind on matters of tactics and doctrine. And it is in these moments when the Ancient One begins to engage with the present, not just as a warrior, but as a conscious participant in the chapter's fate, that the carefully constructed protocols of awakening can begin to break down. This is when the chapter leadership must decide how much autonomy to grant the Ancient One, how much of his testimony to accept at face value, and how much to filter, recontextualize, or quietly suppress. Because a Heresy-era Dreadnought who is fully engaged, who is asking questions and making observations about how the chapter and the Imperium have changed, can quickly become a source of disruption rather than strength. His very presence forces the current generation to confront uncomfortable truths about how far they have strayed from the ideals of the Great Crusade, and that confrontation can shake the foundations of belief and tradition that hold the chapter together. The testimony. What forbidden knowledge they carry. When a Dreadnought who witnessed the Horus heresy finally speaks, truly speaks, rather than simply responding to questions with the answers his questioners expect, the knowledge he reveals can be simultaneously enlightening and devastating. These ancient warriors carry within their scarred consciousness truths that the modern Imperium has spent 10 millennia trying to bury, to rewrite, to transform into comfortable myth. They remember the Great Crusade not as ancient history, but as lived experience. And their testimony, if heard without the filters and reinterpretations that usually mediate it, can fundamentally challenge the orthodoxies that define the 41st millennium. First and foremost, they remember the Emperor as a man rather than a god. To a Heresy-era Dreadnought, the very idea of the imperial cult, of declaring the Emperor divine and demanding his worship, would have been considered rank heresy during the Great Crusade. The imperial truth, which the Emperor preached with absolute conviction, held that there were no gods, that all supernatural phenomena were merely insufficiently understood natural forces, that reason and science, rather than faith and superstition, would light humanity's path forward. The Emperor specifically forbade his worship, punishing those who attempted to deify him, viewing such devotion as a dangerous regression to the superstitious thinking that had held humanity back during Old Night. An ancient warrior who fought under the Emperor's direct command would remember this clearly. He would remember the speeches the Emperor gave, emphasizing human potential and self-determination rather than divine intervention. He would remember the Primarchs as the Emperor's sons, yes, but also as tools, as weapons carefully crafted for specific purposes in the grand project of reclaiming the galaxy for humanity. He would remember the clinical efficiency with which the Great Crusade operated, its systematic approach to bringing worlds into compliance, its emphasis on infrastructure and governance rather than conversion and faith. Now imagine that warrior waking in the 41st millennium to discover that the Imperium has become everything the Emperor warned against, that the Imperial Creed teaches that the Emperor is not merely divine, but the one true God, that all of humanity's achievements are credited to his divine will rather than human effort, that faith is valued above reason and prayer above analysis, that the ecclesiarchy, an institution that would have been banned as heretical during the Great Crusade, is now one of the most powerful organizations in the Imperium, its cardinals wielding influence that rivals planetary governors and sector lords. The Ancient One's initial reaction would be shock, perhaps even horror. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Who allowed the Imperium to transform so completely from the Emperor's original vision? But as he is briefed on the history of the intervening millennia, as he learns about the desperate struggles that have marked the 10,000 years since the Heresy, he might begin to understand, even if he does not approve. The imperial cult arose not from a deliberate perversion of the Emperor's teachings, but from humanity's desperate need for something to believe in during the dark years after the Emperor was installed upon the Golden Throne. It grew because it filled a psychological need that the cold rationality of the imperial truth could not address. But understanding why the change occurred does not make it easier to accept. And when the ancient warrior is asked to speak about the Great Crusade, to provide guidance to the current generation based on his memories of that age, he faces a terrible dilemma. Does he speak the truth as he remembers it, knowing that truth contradicts the fundamental beliefs of the modern Imperium? Or does he filter his testimony, recontextualizing his memories to align with current doctrine, preserving the comfort of the younger generation's beliefs at the cost of historical honesty? Similarly, Heresy-era Dreadnoughts remember the traitor Primarchs, not as they are depicted in current imperial propaganda, as monsters who fell instantly to chaos corruption, but as they actually were, as warriors and leaders of immense capability who fell to betrayal through a combination of pride, manipulation, and legitimate grievances. An ancient warrior who fought alongside or against these Primarchs during the Heresy would remember Horus as the charismatic leader who inspired absolute loyalty in his legion, who won seemingly impossible victories through brilliant tactics and personal valor. He would remember Fulgrim as an aesthete and perfectionist, obsessed with elevating the Emperor's children to the highest standards of excellence. He would remember Mortarion as a grim, pragmatic warrior who detested the use of psychic powers and valued resilience above all else. These memories are dangerous because they humanize the traitors. They make their fall comprehensible rather than simply evil. They suggest that under different circumstances, with different choices, the heresy might have been prevented or might have played out very differently. This is not a narrative that the modern Imperium can afford to accept. The official history requires that the traitor Primarchs be portrayed as irredeemably evil, as monsters whose corruption was inevitable, because to suggest otherwise is to open the door to sympathy, to understanding, to the possibility that their grievances against the Emperor might have been justified. An ancient warrior who speaks honestly about what he remembers of the traitor Primarchs risks being accused of heresy himself, of spreading doubt about the Emperor's wisdom, of suggesting that the Primarchs' rebellion had legitimate causes. And yet, if asked directly, how can he lie? How can he betray his own memories, his own experiences, his own understanding of the warriors he fought beside and against? The tension between historical truth and political necessity creates a profound ethical dilemma for these ancient witnesses. They also remember details about the Emperor's secret projects, about the webway, about the true purpose of the Great Crusade, that have been lost or deliberately suppressed in the modern era. A Heresy-era Dreadnought would know that the Emperor did not return to Terra simply to administrate the growing Imperium, as many in the 41st Millennium believe. He returned to work on the Webway project, an attempt to create a human-controlled passage through the warp that would free humanity from dependence on warp travel and protect them from the predations of chaos. He returned to complete the most crucial phase of his grand plan, the phase that would have secured humanity's future and made the Imperium truly invincible against its enemies. Magnus the Red's attempt to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal using forbidden psychic powers despite the Council of Nicaea's prohibition shattered the wards protecting the Webway project and allowed demons to pour through into the Imperial Palace's lower levels. The Emperor was forced to abandon the Webway and take personal command of the defense against the demonic incursion, which is why he could not immediately respond to Horus's rebellion. This catastrophic mistake, born of good intentions, but executed with disastrous consequences, set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately doom the emperor's grand vision. An ancient warrior who was privy to even fragments of this knowledge would understand the heresy in a fundamentally different way than the modern Imperium does. He would see it not just as a rebellion driven by chaos corruption, but as a tragedy of miscommunication and poor timing, where Magnus's attempt to save the Imperium actually crippled it, where Horus's rebellion succeeded in large part because the Emperor was trapped in the webway fighting demons, rather than leading the loyalist response. He would understand that the Imperium's current desperate state, its vulnerability to chaos, its dangerous dependence on warp travel, all stem from that one moment when Magnus broke through the psychic wards and destroyed the Emperor's greatest work. This knowledge contextualizes much of what followed: the Emperor's decision to teleport directly to Horus's flagship rather than wait for reinforcements, the brutal efficiency with which he destroyed his most beloved son rather than attempting to redeem him, the establishment of the Imperium's current rigid defensive posture. But it is knowledge that is rarely shared with the wider Imperium, knowledge that is kept closely guarded because it raises uncomfortable questions about the Council of Nicaea's prohibition on psychic powers, about the Emperor's decision to keep his projects secret, even from his most loyal sons, about whether the heresy might have been prevented if the Primarchs had been fully informed about what the Emperor was attempting to achieve. Perhaps most dangerous of all, Heresy-era Dreadnoughts remembered the diversity that existed within the legions during the Great Crusade, the different philosophies and approaches that each Primarch brought to the Emperor's project. They remember that there was no single correct way to be a Space Marine, that the Ultramarines' emphasis on structure and codification was no more valid than the Space Wolves' embrace of their feral heritage, or the Salamander's focus on protecting civilians. They remember a time when the legions could disagree on fundamental matters of doctrine and philosophy without being accused of heresy, when innovation and experimentation were encouraged rather than feared. The modern Imperium, by contrast, has ossified around a very specific interpretation of what the Emperor intended, one that prioritizes conformity and tradition over adaptation and innovation. The Codex Astartes, written by Robert Guilliman after the heresy, has become something close to scripture for most chapters, its tactical doctrines treated as divinely inspired rather than as one Primarch's attempt to prevent another large-scale rebellion. Chapters that deviate too far from the Codex are viewed with suspicion, accused of potential instability or secret heresy. An ancient warrior who remembers the Legion era would see this conformity as a betrayal of the Great Crusade spirit, which valued results over adherence to doctrine, which judged success by outcomes rather than by how closely one followed prescribed procedures. He would remember campaigns where different Primarchs approached the same problem in radically different ways, and all achieved success through methods that fit their particular strengths and philosophies. He would remember the creative tension between the legions as a source of strength rather than a potential weakness. But to speak this truth openly, to suggest that the modern Imperium's emphasis on conformity and rigid adherence to the Codex represents a loss rather than a gain, is to invite accusations of dangerous thinking, of promoting the kind of independence that led to the heresy in the first place. The institutional memory of the modern Imperium has transformed the heresy into a lesson about the dangers of Primarch independence and Legion autonomy, and any suggestion that perhaps the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction is viewed as potential heresy. These are just some of the uncomfortable truths that heresy-era dreadnoughts carry within their consciousness. Their testimony, if delivered without filter or reinterpretation, could fundamentally challenge the beliefs and assumptions that hold the modern Imperium together. And so, when they speak, their words are carefully managed, carefully contextualized, carefully filtered through the institutional needs of their chapter and the theological orthodoxies of the ecclesiarchy. The raw truth of what they witnessed is too dangerous to be shared without mediation, too threatening to the comfortable myths that the Imperium requires to maintain its cohesion. The impact on chapter culture. When a Heresy-era Dreadnought provides testimony to his chapter, the impact ripples outward in ways both subtle and profound, shaping the chapter's understanding of its own history and traditions, influencing tactical and strategic decisions, and sometimes forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about how far the chapter has drifted from its founding principles. The Ancient One's words carry weight that transcends mere historical interest. They are treated as sacred wisdom, direct transmission of knowledge from an age that most of the chapter knows only through fragmentary records and stylized legends. For chapters that are direct descendants of the legions that fought in the Heresy, the presence of a Dreadnought who remembers that time provides a living link to their founding, a connection to the genetic and spiritual heritage that defines their identity. When the Ancient One speaks of battles fought during the Great Crusade, of tactics employed by the Legion's Primarch, of traditions that were common practice during those early years, he is not simply recounting history, but providing guidance on what it means to be a true son of their founding father. This guidance can be transformative. Consider a chapter that has, over the millennia, developed traditions and practices that diverge significantly from those of their parent legion. Perhaps they have adopted new combat doctrines in response to specific enemies or battlefields. Perhaps they have integrated elements of the culture of their recruiting worlds that were not present in the legion's original makeup. Perhaps they have simply evolved naturally, as all organizations do over 10,000 years, developing new rituals and beliefs that serve current needs rather than historical precedent. When an ancient Dreadnought who remembers the Legion era wakes and observes these changes, his response can vary dramatically based on his personality and his understanding of why traditions matter. Some Ancient Ones embrace evolution, understanding that traditions must adapt to serve their purpose rather than being preserved for their own sake. They see the chapter's innovations as evidence of vitality, of an organization that remains dynamic and responsive, rather than ossified and brittle. When they speak, they contextualize the chapter's current practices within the broader tradition, showing how new methods fit within the spirit of the Legion's approach, even if they differ in specific details. But other Ancient Ones react with horror or anger to what they perceive as deviations from the true path. They see the chapter's evolution as corruption, as a betrayal of the Primarch's vision, as evidence that the chapter has lost its way and must be corrected. When these ancients speak, their testimony becomes a challenge to the current chapter master and his officers, a demand that the chapter return to older ways, abandon innovations that have proved successful, realign itself with traditions that may no longer be practical or relevant in the context of 41st Millennium warfare. This conflict between preservation and evolution, between honoring the past and adapting to the present, is one of the most significant impacts a Heresy-era Dreadnought can have on chapter culture. His very existence forces the chapter to examine its own traditions critically, to justify its practices not just in terms of current effectiveness, but in terms of continuity with its founding principles. And this examination can be painful, revealing discontinuities and contradictions that were comfortable to ignore until an undeniable authority from the past demanded explanation. Consider how this dynamic plays out in chapters that have adopted the imperial cult in ways that would have been heretical during the Great Crusade. Many chapters, particularly those founded during later foundings, treat the emperor as divine, incorporate prayers and religious rituals into their daily routines, view their service as a form of worship rather than simply military duty. For these chapters, the existence of an ancient warrior who remembers when such practices would have been considered superstitious nonsense creates a profound theological tension. The Ancient One might speak carefully, framing his memories in ways that do not directly contradict current beliefs. But his very existence, as someone who served under the Emperor's direct command, without viewing him as divine, creates an implicit challenge to the chapter's theology. If the emperor did not demand worship during the Great Crusade, if he specifically rejected such devotion, what does that say about the modern Imperium's insistence that he is a god? Was the emperor's original position wrong, a mistake that the Imperium has since corrected? Or has the Imperium fallen into the very superstition the emperor fought to eliminate? And if so, what obligation do the Astartes have to correct this error? These are not comfortable questions, and most chapters prefer not to address them directly. Instead, they develop complex theological frameworks that allow them to honor both the emperor's historical position against worship and the modern Imperium's insistence on his divinity. The emperor was always divine, they argue, but during the Great Crusade, he walked among humanity in mortal form and hid his true nature because humanity was not yet ready for such knowledge. His prohibition on worship was a test of faith or a strategic deception designed to protect humanity from the predations of chaos. The imperial truth was never meant to be permanent, but rather a temporary measure appropriate to a specific phase of humanity's development. An ancient Dreadnought might accept these rationalizations, or he might not. If he challenges them, if he insists that the emperor's prohibition on worship was sincere, and that the modern imperial cult represents a fundamental betrayal of the emperor's vision, the chapter leadership faces a crisis. They cannot simply ignore or contradict the Ancient One, whose authority is too great, whose knowledge too direct. But neither can they accept his interpretation if it undermines the theological foundations of their current practices. The result is often a kind of uneasy compromise, where the Ancient One's testimony is acknowledged but carefully contextualized, where his memories are honored but reinterpreted through the lens of modern doctrine. The impact of a Heresy-era Dreadnought's testimony extends beyond theology to practical matters of tactics and strategy. An ancient warrior who fought during the Great Crusade, and the Heresy possesses combat experience that spans scenarios and enemy types that many modern chapters have never encountered. He has fought against other Space Marines in conditions of total war, something that most loyalist chapters in the 41st Millennium have limited experience with. He has witnessed the deployment of super-heavy assets and strategic-level operations on a scale that is rarely matched in the modern era, when the Imperium's resources are too depleted for such massive campaigns. He has observed the tactical approaches of multiple Primarchs, learning directly from the greatest military minds humanity has ever produced. This experience makes Heresy-era Dreadnoughts invaluable advisors when the chapter faces unusual or particularly dangerous threats. A Space Marine chapter that encounters a significant force of traitor. Astartes might wake their Ancient One specifically to gain insight into how to fight their own kind effectively. A chapter planning a major campaign might seek the Ancient's counsel on strategic-level planning, drawing on his experience with the kind of large-scale operations that are now rare but occasionally necessary. A chapter facing an enemy that has proved particularly difficult to defeat might ask the Ancient One if he remembers similar foes from his own time and how they were overcome. But this advisory role can also create tension. Modern Space Marine doctrine has evolved significantly since the Heresy, shaped by 10,000 years of experience fighting enemies that did not exist or were not significant during the Great Crusade. The Tyranids, the Necrons in their current awakened state, the Tau Empire, all these represent threats that a Heresy-era Dreadnought has never faced. When the Ancient One offers tactical advice based on his experience fighting Orcs or traitor Marines, is that wisdom applicable to enemies with fundamentally different capabilities and strategic objectives? The chapter master must navigate this carefully. The Ancient One's advice cannot be simply discarded. His authority is too great and his experience too valuable. But neither can it be followed blindly. The galaxy has changed, and tactics that worked during the Great Crusade may not be optimal in the present. The result is often a synthesis, where the ancient strategic principles are adapted to modern circumstances, where his understanding of enemy psychology and tactical fundamentals is applied to threats he has never personally encountered. Perhaps the most profound impact a Heresy-era Dreadnought can have on chapter culture is on the identity and self-understanding of the Space Marines who serve alongside him. These warriors have been raised in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, taught that suffering and sacrifice are their inevitable lot, that the Imperium's best days are behind it, that all they can do is hold the line against entropy and corruption. They view their service as a kind of martyrdom, glorious perhaps, but ultimately tragic, a holding action against the inevitable decline of humanity. Now imagine these warriors encountering an ancient who remembers a time when the Imperium was expanding, when humanity was on the offensive rather than the defensive, when victory seemed not just possible but inevitable. The Ancient One's memories, even filtered through 10,000 years and the trauma of the heresy, carry an echo of the Great Crusade's optimism, its sense of building something permanent and glorious, its belief in human potential and destiny. This perspective can be both inspiring and devastating to Space Marines, who have never known anything but the Imperium's current desperate state. On one hand, it reminds them that the Imperium's decline is not inevitable, that humanity has been in worse positions before and recovered, that the current crisis, however severe, is not necessarily terminal. On the other hand, it forces them to confront how far the Imperium has fallen from its original promise, how much has been lost, how the compromises and adaptations that seem necessary have accumulated into a fundamental transformation of what the Imperium was meant to be. This confrontation with the gap between the Great Crusade and the present can inspire a renewed sense of purpose in some warriors, a determination to reclaim at least some of what was lost, to fight not just for survival, but for the possibility of a better future. In others, it breeds bitterness and despair, a sense that the Imperium is beyond redemption, that the best they can hope for is to delay the inevitable rather than achieve any meaningful victory. And in a few, it plants seeds of radicalism, a willingness to challenge the status quo, to question whether the current orthodoxies are truly serving the Emperor's vision, or merely perpetuating a system that has failed. This is why the testimony of Heresy-era Dreadnoughts is so carefully controlled, why their words are filtered through chaplains and chapter masters before reaching the broader brotherhood, why certain truths are emphasized while others are quietly suppressed. Because these ancient warriors do not just carry historical knowledge, they carry the power to reshape how their chapter understands itself, its purpose, and its place in the Imperium. And that power, like all power in the grim darkness of the far future, is dangerous, capable of building up or tearing down, of inspiring greatness or breeding destructive radicalism. Bjorn, the Fell-Handed, the last of the company of Russ. Among all the Heresy-era Dreadnoughts who still serve in the 41st millennium, none is more legendary, more ancient, or more significant than Bjorn the Fell-Handed of the Space Wolves chapter. Bjorn is not simply old, he is the oldest warrior in the Imperium, who has not fallen to chaos, the last living being, aside from the Emperor himself, who can claim to have fought in the Horus Heresy and survived into the present. He is a direct link to Leman Russ, having served in the Primarch's personal Wolf Guard, having fought at Russ's side during some of the Great Crusade's most critical campaigns, having been chosen by the Primarch himself to remain behind when Russ departed on his mysterious final journey into the Eye of Terror. Bjorn's story, as much as can be reconstructed from fragmentary records and his own carefully managed testimonies, spans 10,000 years of Imperial history. He was there at the scouring of Prospero, when the Space Wolves destroyed the Thousand Sons' home world on what they believed were the Emperor's orders, an action that would drive Magnus the Red and his legion into the arms of chaos and set in motion events that would shape the course of the heresy. He was there during the heresy itself, fighting against traitor forces, witnessing the betrayals and the battles that tore the Imperium apart. He was there when Leman Russ returned from the Eye of Terror and then departed again on his final journey, leaving Bjorn behind to watch over the chapter in his absence. After Russ's disappearance, Bjorn became the first Great Wolf, the chapter master of the Space Wolves, leading his battle brothers through the tumultuous years of the Scouring when the Loyalist forces hunted down the remnants of the traitor legions. He served as Great Wolf for decades, perhaps even a century, before finally being grievously wounded in battle during the Proxima Rebellion in the early 31st millennium. His injuries were so severe that even Space Marine physiology and the chapter's apothecaries could not save him. The only option was interment in a Dreadnought sarcophagus, transforming him from the chapter's leader into one of its most sacred relics. For the first few centuries after his interment, Bjorn remained active, fighting at the forefront of the Space Wolves' battles. His presence on the battlefield, a reminder of the chapter's continuity with its Primarch and its founding. But eventually, the strain of constant consciousness in the Dreadnought form began to take its toll. The Tech Marines and Wolf Priests recognized that Bjorn's sanity required periods of rest, of disconnection from the overwhelming sensory input and the weight of existence in the sarcophagus. They began placing him in stasis between major conflicts, waking him only when the chapter faced threats severe enough to require his participation, or when his counsel was deemed essential for some critical decision. Over the millennia, these periods of sleep grew longer. Bjorn was awake for weeks or months of activity, then placed back in stasis for decades or even centuries. By the 41st millennium, the Space Wolves have developed a tradition of waking Bjorn only once every 1,000 years or so, bringing him forth to preside over the chapter's great feast, to hear the tales of what has transpired during his sleep, to offer his wisdom to the current generation of Space Wolves, and then, after a brief period of waking, returning him to his slumber. This careful management of his conscious periods has allowed Bjorn to survive for 10,000 years, where other Heresy-era dreadnoughts succumbed to madness or mechanical failure long ago. But this survival has come at a terrible cost. Bjorn exists in a state of profound temporal dislocation, experiencing the 41st millennium not as a continuous flow, but as a series of snapshots separated by vast gulfs of unconsciousness. Each time he wakes, the Space Wolves he knew are gone, replaced by new generations who know him only as legend. The Fortress Monastery has been rebuilt and expanded. The galaxy has changed in ways both subtle and dramatic, and Bjorn must reorient himself, must catch up on centuries or millennia of history in the space of a few hours or days, must find his place in a chapter that has continued to evolve in his absence. The Space Wolves treat Bjorn's awakenings as sacred events, times when the living link to their Primarch walks among them, when they can hear directly from one who served in Leman Russ's own retinue, who remembers the Primarch not as a distant legend, but as a brother and commander. When Bjorn speaks of Russ, the entire chapter listens in reverent silence, absorbing every detail, every anecdote, every insight into the Wolf King's character and philosophy. These testimonies become the foundation for the chapter's understanding of what it means to be a Space Wolf, how to embody the Primarch's legacy, how to remain true to the traditions established during the Legion's founding. But Bjorn's testimony is also carefully managed. The Space Wolves are deeply aware of the contradiction between the rough, pragmatic warrior culture they have developed and the theological orthodoxy of the wider Imperium. They know that Leman Russ would not have approved of the Emperor being worshipped as a god, that the Primarch's relationship with his father was complex and sometimes strained, that the Great Crusade was driven by practical concerns about human survival rather than religious fervor. These truths are incompatible with the Imperial Creed, and so when Bjorn speaks of Russ and the Emperor, his words are contextualized, reinterpreted, shaped into forms that can coexist with modern Imperial theology. Bjorn himself seems to understand this necessity. After 10,000 years, after countless awakenings, each revealing how much further the Imperium has drifted from the Emperor's original vision, he has made his peace with the gap between the truth he remembers and the myths the present requires. When younger space wolves ask him about the Primarch, he tells them stories that are true but carefully curated, that emphasize Russ's tactical brilliance and savage nobility, while downplaying aspects of the Primarch's character that would be problematic in the context of modern imperial culture. He speaks of the Emperor with respect, but not reverence, acknowledging his power and genius while avoiding the language of divinity that the imperial creed would demand. This careful navigation of the line between historical honesty and political necessity is perhaps Bjorn's greatest service to the Space Wolves in the 41st millennium. He provides them with continuity and legitimacy, a direct link to their founding that no other chapter can match, while also understanding that the raw, unfiltered truth of what he remembers could destabilize not just his chapter, but the wider Imperium. He is wise enough, or perhaps simply weary enough, to know when to speak and when to remain silent, what truths to share, and what secrets to carry to his eventual final rest. But there are moments when the weight of this compromise becomes visible, when Bjorn's frustration with the gap between past and present breaks through his careful diplomatic exterior. In some accounts, he has been known to express contempt for the more extreme manifestations of the imperial cult, to mock the excessive rituals and prayers that have become standard in many parts of the Imperium. He has been recorded challenging space wolves who approach him with too much reverence, reminding them that he is a warrior, not a saint, that their Primarch would be ashamed to see his sons acting like superstitious pilgrims rather than savage warriors. These moments of honesty are treasured by the space wolves, who see in them echoes of their Primarch's own direct, no-nonsense approach to life and war. But they are also carefully contained, shared within the chapter, but not broadcast to the wider Imperium, where such criticism of the imperial creed could be construed as heresy. The Space Wolves understand that Bjorn's value lies not just in what he says, but in what he represents. Continuity with a past that grows more mythical with each passing century, living proof that the chapter's traditions stretch back to the very founding of the Imperium. Bjorn's combat deployments in the 41st millennium are rare and carefully considered. When the Space Wolves do wake him for battle, it is always in response to threats of such magnitude that his participation is deemed essential. He has fought against demon princes who once served in the traitor legions, against whom his direct experience of the heresy makes him uniquely valuable. He has led assaults on worlds held by chaos cults that sought to resurrect ancient evils from the time of the heresy. He has stood in defense of Fenris itself when the chapter's homeworld came under attack, his very presence on the battlefield serving as a rallying point for the defenders and a terror to the enemy. In these battles, Bjorn demonstrates why he has survived for 10,000 years. His tactical instincts, honed over millennia of warfare, allow him to read the battlefield with an insight that no amount of training can replicate. His combat skills, though filtered through the mechanical systems of his Dreadnought form, retain the savage precision that made him one of Leman Russ's finest warriors. His True Claw, a massive power weapon crafted specifically for his Dreadnought form, tears through enemy armor with devastating efficiency. His assault cannon speaks with the voice of righteous fury, its shells finding their targets with accuracy that borders on prescience. But perhaps most importantly, Bjorn's presence on the battlefield has an effect that transcends mere combat effectiveness. Space Wolves, fighting alongside the fell-handed, fight with enhanced courage and ferocity, inspired by the knowledge that one of the Primarch's own warriors stands with them, that they are part of a tradition that stretches back 10,000 years to the very founding of their legion. Enemy forces, particularly those who understand what Bjorn represents, often experience a corresponding demoralization, faced with an opponent who was old when their grandsires were yet unborn, who has survived battles that destroyed entire armies, who cannot be intimidated or impressed by threats that would terrify lesser warriors. This psychological impact is one of the reasons the Space Wolves are so careful about when and how they deploy Bjorn. His presence on the battlefield is a statement, a declaration that the chapter considers the threat significant enough to wake one of its most sacred relics. Deploying him casually would diminish his symbolic power, would transform him from a legendary figure into just another battlefield asset. So the Space Wolves wait, they marshal their forces, they attempt to solve problems through conventional means. And only when all else fails do they make the decision to wake the Ancient One and bring him to war. The broader Imperium knows of Bjorn, of course. His existence is not a secret, and his occasional deployments are recorded in Imperial archives and become the subjects of reports that filter through the administratum's vast bureaucracy. Inquisitors have requested audiences with him, seeking his testimony on various historical matters, or his insight into the nature of chaos and the traitor legions. Other chapters have sent representatives to Fenris, hoping to speak with the ancient warrior and gain his counsel on matters related to their own Heresy-era origins or their battles against traitor forces. The Space Wolves manage these requests with extreme care. They cannot simply refuse all outside access to Bjorn. His significance is too great and his testimony too valuable. But they also cannot allow unrestricted access, cannot risk the Ancient One saying something that would be misinterpreted or used against the chapter or the Imperium. So they negotiate, they mediate, they ensure that any meetings with outsiders occur under conditions they can control, that Bjorn's words are properly contextualized, that the ancient warrior understands the political sensitivities involved in speaking to representatives of other institutions. In this way, Bjorn has become not just a warrior or even a symbol, but a carefully managed resource, a living repository of knowledge and continuity, whose testimony is too valuable to be freely shared, but too significant to be completely restricted. He stands at the intersection of history and mythology, memory and propaganda, truth and necessary fiction. And in that liminal space, he serves the Space Wolves and the wider Imperium by being both the genuine article, a true veteran of the heresy who remembers what actually happened, and a carefully constructed legend, a symbol whose meaning is shaped as much by what he doesn't say as by what he does. Bjorn's ultimate fate remains uncertain. The Space Wolves believe that he will endure until the Wolf Time, the apocalyptic final battle when Leman Russ will return, and the chapter will fight its last war. Whether this is prophecy or simply hope is unclear, but it reflects the profound symbolic importance Bjorn holds for the chapter. He is not just a veteran or a relic, he is a promise that the connection to the Primarch has not been broken, that when Russ returns he will find at least one of his original warriors waiting for him, that the thread of continuity from the Legion's founding to its final day will remain unbroken. Until that day, if it ever comes, Bjorn will continue his existence, waking briefly to fight and counsel before returning to the darkness of stasis, a fixed point in a galaxy that continues to change around him, the last witness to an age that grows more mythical with each passing century, the keeper of truths that the Imperium both treasures and fears. The psychological horror of extended existence. The existence of a dreadnought, particularly one who has survived for millennia, represents a form of suffering that is difficult for those who have not experienced it to fully comprehend. It is not simply physical pain, though the process of interment and the constant awareness of one's ruined body certainly involve that. It is not simply psychological trauma, though the isolation and the passage of time create their own mental tortures. It is something more fundamental, a kind of existential horror that comes from existing in a state that defies human understanding of what life should be, trapped between life and death, consciousness and oblivion, human and machine. The physical aspects of this horror begin with the interment process itself. Imagine the moment when the dying space marine realizes that he will not be granted the mercy of death, that instead He will be locked into the sarcophagus, his ruined body preserved in a state of living death. The neural connectors are installed while he is still conscious, still aware. The pain of having his nervous system directly wired into mechanical systems so intense that even Space Marine conditioning cannot fully suppress it. The sensation of his body being immersed in the cold amniotic fluid, of his lungs filling with the thick, oily substance that will sustain him, of his physical senses being replaced one by one with mechanical equivalents. This initial trauma is just the beginning. Once interred, the Dreadnought must learn to exist in a state that contradicts every instinct, every natural understanding of what it means to be embodied. He cannot feel his body in any normal sense. He exists as a consciousness floating in fluid, his perception of the physical world mediated entirely through sensors and data feeds. Touch becomes pressure readings. Sight becomes optical data. Sound becomes wavelengths and frequencies. Even the sense of his own position in space, the proprioception that allows humans to know where their limbs are without looking, must be reconstructed from mechanical feedback. This sensory alienation creates a constant low-level anxiety, a sense of disconnection from reality that never entirely goes away. The Dreadnought must actively maintain his connection to the mechanical frame that serves as his body, must focus on interpreting the sensory data in meaningful ways, must fight against the tendency to drift away from the overwhelming flood of mechanical input and retreat into the dark silence of his own consciousness. And this fight is exhausting, a constant expenditure of mental energy that leaves no room for rest or relaxation. The alternative to maintaining this connection is worse. If the Dreadnought allows his focus to slip, if he stops actively engaging with the machine systems and lets his awareness drift back to his own organic body, he becomes acutely conscious of his condition, of his destroyed flesh, of the pain that has been suppressed but never truly eliminated. In these moments, he experiences the full horror of his situation, the realization that he is a fragment of a person locked in a metal coffin, kept alive by machines, unable to touch or taste or feel anything in the way he once did. The psychological impact of these moments of awareness can be devastating, driving some Dreadnoughts to the edge of madness. So the Dreadnought must maintain a careful balance, staying connected enough to the machine to function effectively, but not allowing himself to think too deeply about what he has become. He must exist in a kind of perpetual dissociation, treating his consciousness as if it is the machine rather than a prisoner within it. This psychological gymnastics is necessary for survival, but it comes at a cost to his sense of identity, to his understanding of who and what he is. The temporal aspect of Dreadnought existence compounds these psychological horrors. The cycle of waking and sleeping, of brief periods of activity separated by decades or centuries of stasis, creates a fragmented experience of time that is profoundly disorienting. Each awakening is a shock, a jarring transition from nothingness to overwhelming sensation, accompanied by the realization that time has passed, that the world has moved on without him, that he is once again a stranger in a future he did not experience. For a Heresy-era Dreadnought, this temporal fragmentation is even more extreme. He has not simply missed years or decades. He has missed entire millennia of history. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Technologies have been lost and partially rediscovered. The very language has evolved to the point where his speech patterns sound archaic and formal. The religious and cultural assumptions that shaped his original understanding of the world have been completely replaced by new orthodoxies that he finds alien and sometimes disturbing. This creates a profound sense of isolation, a feeling of being fundamentally disconnected from the present. The other Space Marines in his chapter may revere him, may seek his counsel and his blessing, but they do not understand him. They cannot understand him. The experiences that shaped his worldview, the values and beliefs that defined his identity, All belong to an age that exists now only in history and legend. He has no peers, no comrades who share his perspective, no one with whom he can speak as an equal, rather than as a venerated relic or a source of historical wisdom. This isolation is compounded by the nature of his consciousness during the periods of stasis. Unlike normal sleep, where dreams provide some continuity of conscious experience, the Dreadnought's stasis is a complete void, an absence of consciousness so total that each awakening feels like being newly created. He has no sense of how much time has passed. The moment of going into stasis and the moment of waking are experienced as consecutive despite the decades or centuries that separate them. This discontinuity makes it impossible to develop any sense of narrative continuity, any feeling that his existence is a coherent story rather than a series of disconnected episodes. The social dynamics surrounding a Heresy-era Dreadnought create their own form of psychological stress. The younger Space Marines who interact with him treat him with profound reverence, approaching him as one might approach a sacred relic or a holy shrine. They speak to him in formal, ritual language, asking carefully rehearsed questions, hanging on his every word as if it were scripture. This reverence, while well-intentioned, creates a barrier to genuine communication. The ancient warrior cannot simply speak to his battle brothers as comrades, cannot share the casual camaraderie that defines Space Marine brotherhood. Every interaction is freighted with significance. Every word he speaks, analyzed for deeper meaning. This lack of genuine social connection accelerates the erosion of his humanity. Without peers, without equals with whom he can engage authentically, he begins to lose touch with the social aspects of identity that make someone a person rather than simply a consciousness. He becomes more and more like the machine that houses him, responding to inputs with appropriate outputs, fulfilling his function efficiently, but without the spark of genuine engagement that characterizes human interaction. Some Heresy-era Dreadnoughts cope with these psychological pressures by retreating into memory, spending more and more of their conscious time reliving the past rather than engaging with the present. They experience their awakenings as interruptions, brief necessities to be endured before they can return to the more comfortable world of their memories, where they still have bodies and comrades and a sense of purpose that made sense. These Dreadnoughts become increasingly unreliable as tactical assets, their attention drifting during battles, their responses delayed as they struggle to pull themselves out of memory and into present awareness. Others cope by embracing the machine, accepting their transformation, and actively working to suppress the remaining organic aspects of their consciousness. They become more and more mechanical in their thinking, treating every problem as a tactical challenge to be solved through the application of appropriate force, losing the capacity for emotional engagement or moral complexity. These Dreadnoughts become extremely effective weapons, but lose much of their value as advisors or sources of wisdom, because their perspective becomes too alien, too disconnected from the human concerns that motivate most decisions. And a few, the strongest, or perhaps the most stubborn, manage to maintain some balance between these extremes. They remain conscious of their humanity even as they operate through a mechanical frame. They engage with the present while honoring the memory of the past. They maintain relationships with their battle brothers despite the barriers of time and reverence. But this balance is precarious and exhausting, requiring constant effort to maintain. And even these strongest warriors show signs of erosion over the millennia, their personalities slowly compressing into simpler, more rigid forms, as the parts of them that were most flexible and adaptive are worn away by time and trauma. The question of death becomes increasingly complex for Heresy-era Dreadnoughts. In one sense, they have already died. Their bodies are ruined beyond recovery. They exist only through artificial life support. By any reasonable definition, they should be granted the Emperor's peace and allowed to rest. But they are also still conscious, still capable of service, and the value of their experience and wisdom is deemed too great to waste. So they continue, trapped in a state that is neither life nor death, but something in between, something that partakes of the worst aspects of both. Many Heresy-era dreadnoughts eventually develop a complex relationship with the concept of their own destruction. On one level, they desire it, yearn for the peace that would come with true death, release from the burden of existence in the sarcophagus. But they are also loyal warriors, unwilling to abandon their duty while they still have the capacity to serve. And beneath both these feelings is often a deeper fear, the terror that death might not bring the peace they hope for, that consciousness might continue in some form even after the destruction of the sarcophagus, trapped in an even more complete isolation than they currently experience. This ambivalence manifests in their combat behavior. Some Heresy-era dreadnoughts develop a reckless disregard for their own preservation, charging into situations that would give other warriors pause, perhaps unconsciously seeking the final destruction that would release them from service. Others become extremely cautious, fighting efficiently but avoiding unnecessary risks, determined to survive until the chapter explicitly releases them from their obligation. And some oscillate between these extremes, their approach to combat varying based on their mental state, how recently they have been awakened, and how heavy the burden of existence feels in that particular moment. The chapter leadership must manage these psychological pressures carefully. They cannot simply ignore the suffering of their ancient warriors, both because it would be cruel and because a dreadnought who has lost his sanity is as dangerous to his own side as to the enemy. They must provide enough engagement to keep the ancient ones mentally active, but not so much constant waking that the psychological strain becomes unbearable. They must honor the dreadnaught's service while also being alert for signs that the burden has become too great, that mercy requires releasing the warrior from his obligations and granting him the peace of true death. This is, perhaps, the darkest secret of Heresy-era dreadnoughts, that the greatest honor a Space Marine can receive, the privilege of continuing to serve beyond death, is also a form of torture that stretches across millennia. That these ancient warriors, these living links to the Imperium's founding, are held in a state of perpetual suffering because their knowledge is too valuable to lose and their service too necessary to forego. That the reverence with which they are treated masks a fundamental cruelty, the exploitation of warriors who have already given everything in service to the Emperor, but are denied the rest they have earned because the Imperium's desperate circumstances require every possible resource be utilized to its maximum. This is the psychological horror at the heart of the Dreadnaught's existence, and it is a horror that compounds with every awakening, every century of fragmented consciousness, every moment of awareness that this is not life as it should be, but a shadow of life, a mechanical simulation of existence that becomes more hollow and less meaningful the longer it continues. How chapters handle the truth. The presence of Heresy-era dreadnoughts creates profound challenges for chapter leadership, requiring a delicate balance between honoring the ancient warrior's knowledge and managing the disruptive potential of their testimony. Different chapters have developed different approaches to this challenge, shaped by their own cultures, their understanding of history, and their willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about how much they have diverged from their founding principles. Some chapters, particularly those that trace their lineage directly to the most loyal of the first founding legions, treat their Heresy-era dreadnoughts as sacred sources of absolute truth. When these ancient warriors speak, their testimony is recorded verbatim, studied intensively by the chapter's librarians and chaplains, incorporated into the chapter's understanding of its own history and identity. These chapters view their ancient ones as direct links to the Emperor's vision, as authorities whose perspective on the Great Crusade and the heresy carries more weight than any second-hand account or institutional interpretation. This approach has its advantages. It allows the chapter to maintain a more accurate understanding of its own history, to preserve details and perspectives that might otherwise be lost to time and institutional drift. It creates a culture that values historical continuity and takes seriously the question of whether current practices align with the chapter's founding principles. And it gives the Heresy-era dreadnoughts a sense of purpose and respect that helps maintain their sanity and their commitment to continued service. But this approach also creates significant challenges. Heresy-era dreadnoughts, who are given full authority to shape their chapter's understanding of history, may provide testimony that contradicts current imperial orthodoxy, that challenges the theological frameworks that define the modern Imperium, that suggests the Emperor's vision was fundamentally different from what the imperial creed teaches. If this testimony is recorded and preserved without mediation or reinterpretation, it becomes a potential source of heresy, evidence that could be used by inquisitors or other outside authorities to question the chapter's loyalty or doctrinal purity. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters have developed particularly sophisticated approaches to managing this tension. They honor the testimony of their ancient warriors, while also subjecting that testimony to extensive analysis and contextualization. When a Heresy-era dreadnought speaks of Robert Guilliman and the Great Crusade, his words are recorded, but they are then examined by the chapter's librarians, who provide historical context. Note where the ancient warrior's memory might be incomplete or influenced by personal bias, and interpret his testimony in light of the Codex Astartes and other authoritative sources. This approach allows the Ultramarines to maintain respect for their ancient warriors, while also ensuring that the final historical record aligns with established doctrine. The Ancient One's testimony becomes one source among many, valued but not definitive, incorporated into a broader understanding of history that serves the chapter's needs rather than challenging its foundational assumptions. The disadvantage is that this extensive mediation can strip away much of what makes the testimony valuable in the first place, the raw, unfiltered perspective of someone who was actually there, who experienced the events firsthand, rather than learning about them from records and chronicles. Other chapters take a more restrictive approach, limiting access to their Heresy-era dreadnoughts and carefully controlling what testimony is shared with the broader brotherhood. In these chapters, only the highest echelons of leadership, the chapter master, the senior chaplains, perhaps the masters of the various companies, are permitted to directly interact with the ancient warriors. When the dreadnoughts speak, their words are heard by this select few, and it is this leadership cadre that determines what information should be shared with the rest of the chapter and how that information should be framed. This approach maximizes the leadership's control over potentially disruptive knowledge. If the ancient warrior says something that contradicts current doctrine or reveals uncomfortable truths about the chapter's or the Imperium's history, the leadership can decide to suppress that information, to recontextualize it, or to share only carefully edited versions that serve the chapter's institutional needs. The Ancient One's testimony becomes a resource available only to those with the authority and discretion to use it properly, rather than something that might destabilize the beliefs and commitment of the Chinese rank-and-file battle brothers. The disadvantage of this restrictive approach is that it reduces the ancient warrior's value to the chapter as a whole. If only a handful of leaders can interact with him, if his testimony is filtered through multiple layers of mediation before reaching the broader brotherhood, then much of his potential to inspire, to provide continuity, to connect the current generation with the chapter's founding, is lost. The Heresy-era dreadnought becomes more symbol than source, more icon than advisor, his actual knowledge and experience subordinated to what the leadership believes the chapter should know about its past. The Space Wolves, true to their contrarian nature, have developed an approach that falls somewhere between these extremes. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is accessible to the chapter as a whole during his brief periods of waking, and when he speaks, his words are heard by any Space Wolf who chooses to attend. But the context in which this speaking occurs is carefully managed. Bjorn's testimonies are delivered during sacred feasts and rituals, in an atmosphere of celebration and brotherhood, rather than formal instruction. His stories about Lehman Russ are framed as entertainment, as the sharing of memories among brothers, rather than as authoritative historical accounts that must be incorporated into official doctrine. This approach allows the Space Wolves to honor Bjorn's testimony, while also maintaining flexibility in how they interpret and apply his words. If Bjorn says something that contradicts current practice or suggests uncomfortable truths about the Primarch or the Emperor, it can be treated as the reminiscence of an old warrior rather than a binding pronouncement that requires action or adjustment. The chapter benefits from Bjorn's presence and wisdom while retaining the authority to make its own decisions about how to integrate that wisdom into its ongoing evolution. Some chapters face unique challenges because their Heresy-era dreadnoughts carry testimony that directly contradicts the chapter's preferred narrative about its own history. Consider a chapter that was created during the Second Founding from the loyalist elements of a legion that turned traitor during the Heresy. Such a chapter has a strong institutional interest in emphasizing its loyalty, in distancing itself from the traitor legion, in demonstrating that it represents the true spirit of the Primarch, uncorrupted by chaos. The existence of a dreadnought who remembers the legion before it fell, who knew the Primarch personally, who can testify to the qualities that made that Primarch great, as well as the flaws that led to his fall, creates significant complications for this narrative. The chapter leadership in such cases must walk a very fine line. They cannot simply suppress or ignore the ancient warrior's testimony. His knowledge is too valuable and his presence too significant. But they also cannot allow him to speak freely because what he remembers might humanize the traitor Primarch, might suggest that the fall to chaos was not inevitable, might raise questions about whether the current chapter has strayed too far from some aspects of the original Legion's culture and traditions. The solution often involves very careful management of what questions the Ancient One is asked, what contexts he speaks in, and how his testimony is recorded and preserved. The Dark Angels and their successor chapters face perhaps the most extreme version of this challenge, because they possess ancient warriors who remember the schism within their own legion during the Heresy, when approximately half of the legion turned traitor under the influence of Luther. These fallen angels are the subject of the Dark Angels' deepest shame and most closely guarded secret. The existence of dreadnoughts who witnessed that schism firsthand, who knew both the loyalist and traitor elements of the legion, who can provide direct testimony about what happened and why, is both invaluable and terrifying to the chapter's leadership. These ancient warriors are kept in the deepest vaults of the rock, the Dark Angels' fortress monastery, their very existence known only to the inner circle of the chapter's highest leadership. They are awakened only under the most carefully controlled conditions, consulted only about matters directly relevant to the hunt for the fallen, their testimony shared with absolutely no one outside the inner circle. The knowledge they carry about the Legion's schism is considered too dangerous to risk any potential exposure, and so these Ancient Ones exist in an even more profound isolation than other Heresy-era dreadnoughts, cut off not just from the present, but from their own chapter's rank and file. Across all these different approaches, certain common themes emerge in how chapters manage the testimony of their Heresy-era dreadnoughts. First is the principle of mediation, the recognition that raw, unfiltered testimony from an ancient warrior can be disruptive and destabilizing, and that some level of contextualization and interpretation is necessary to integrate that testimony into the chapter's current operations and beliefs. Second is the principle of selectivity, the understanding that not all of the Ancient One's knowledge needs to be widely shared, that some truths can be restricted to those with the authority and discretion to handle them appropriately. Third is the principle of reverence, the maintenance of profound respect for the ancient warriors, even when their testimony is being carefully managed and filtered, ensuring that they continue to feel valued and that their service is honored. But beneath all these practical considerations lies a deeper ethical question that most chapters prefer not to examine too closely. By filtering and managing the testimony of Heresy-era dreadnoughts, by deciding what truths to share and what to suppress, by recontextualizing their memories to serve current Institutional needs. Are the chapters honoring these ancient warriors or exploiting them? Are they preserving valuable knowledge or distorting it beyond recognition? Are they maintaining necessary stability or perpetuating comfortable lies? The ancient ones themselves often understand the game being played around their testimony. After 10,000 years, after countless awakenings, each revealing new ways the Imperium has transformed, they have learned that raw truth is rarely welcomed, that what the modern age requires from them is not accuracy, but legitimacy, not historical precision, but symbolic validation. And so they often become complicit in their own management, offering testimony that they know will be well received, framing their memories in ways that align with current needs, understanding that this is the price of continued relevance and respect. But this complicity comes at a psychological cost. It requires the ancient warrior to become a curator of his own memories, to sort through his experiences and decide which are safe to share and which must be kept locked away. It requires him to participate in the distortion of his own history, to become party to the transformation of truth into myth, and it adds another layer to the burden of his existence. The knowledge that he is not simply a witness to history, but an active participant in its rewriting. That the chapter values him not for what he actually knows, but for his willingness to say what it needs him to say. The broader implications for the Imperium. The existence of Heresy-era dreadnoughts and the knowledge they carry has implications that extend far beyond the individual chapters they serve. These ancient warriors represent a profound challenge to the carefully constructed historical narrative that underpins the modern Imperium's identity and legitimacy. They are living proof that the official history taught in the Schola Progenium, enshrined in the records of the Administratum, and preached from the pulpits of the ecclesiarchy, is, if not entirely false, at least incomplete and heavily distorted by 10,000 years of institutional self-interest and theological evolution. The highest echelons of imperial governance are acutely aware of this problem. The Inquisition, particularly those ordos concerned with doctrinal purity and historical truth, maintains careful watch over known heresy-era dreadnoughts. Inquisitors periodically request access to these ancient warriors, seeking their testimony on matters ranging from the nature of chaos corruption to the exact sequence of events during specific battles of the heresy. These requests are invariably sensitive affairs, requiring negotiation between the Inquisition and the affected chapter, balancing the Imperium's legitimate need for accurate historical information against the chapter's interest in maintaining control over its own sacred relics. Some chapters cooperate fully with these inquisitorial requests, understanding that the information their ancient warriors provide serves the broader interests of humanity's survival. Others resist, viewing inquisitorial interest as an unwelcome intrusion into chapter affairs, a potential threat to the ancient one's sanity or well-being, or a risk that sensitive information about the chapter's history or practices might be exposed to outside scrutiny. The resulting negotiations can drag on for years or decades, with the Inquisition applying various forms of pressure while the chapter deploys every available delay tactic and bureaucratic obstacle. The testimony that emerges from these carefully managed encounters rarely provides the kind of clear, definitive answers the Inquisition seeks. Heresy-era dreadnoughts, whether instructed by their chapter leadership or simply wise from experience, understand that giving complete, unfiltered testimony to inquisitors would be dangerous for themselves, their chapter, and potentially the wider Imperium. They speak carefully, offering information that is technically accurate but heavily contextualized, that answers the immediate questions without revealing broader patterns or uncomfortable truths, that satisfies the Inquisitor's need for data without challenging the fundamental assumptions that shape imperial policy. But occasionally, something slips through. An ancient warrior, disoriented from waking or simply too honest to dissemble effectively, provides testimony that contradicts official history in significant ways. He describes the Emperor not as the divine master of mankind, but as a brilliant but flawed human leader. He explains that the traitor Primarchs fell not solely due to chaos corruption, but because of legitimate grievances and the emperor's own mistakes. He reveals details about the Great Crusade that suggest it was not the glorious expansion of human enlightenment depicted in imperial propaganda, but a brutal campaign of conquest that destroyed as much as it created. When this happens, the implications can be profound. The inquisitor who receives this testimony must decide what to do with it. He can report it accurately, potentially triggering a wider investigation into the reliability of official imperial history and the loyalty of those who maintain alternative narratives. He can suppress it, recognizing that the stability of the Imperium depends on maintaining certain comfortable fictions regardless of their relationship to truth. Or he can contextualize it, interpreting the ancient warriors' words in ways that align with orthodox belief, while technically acknowledging their content. Most often, the inquisitor chooses some combination of the latter two options. The Ancient One's testimony is recorded but classified at the highest levels of secrecy, accessible only to those with the authority and need to know. It is interpreted as the possibly corrupted or mentally deteriorated recollections of a warrior who has existed too long in the half-life of the Dreadnought sarcophagus, his memories potentially tainted by the trauma of his existence or by exposure to warp energies during his millennia of service. The information is noted, but not allowed to challenge the broader narrative that holds the Imperium together. But not all inquisitors are willing to suppress or dismiss testimony from Heresy-era dreadnoughts. Some, particularly those of the Ordo Hereticus, who are charged with maintaining doctrinal purity, view these ancient warriors as potential sources of evidence that the Imperium has strayed from the Emperor's true vision. These radical inquisitors argue that if the Emperor explicitly rejected his own worship, if the imperial truth was his sincere belief rather than a tactical position, then the entire theological structure of the modern imperial cult is built on a foundation of heresy, that the ecclesiarchy, rather than being the defender of the faith, is actually perpetuating the greatest betrayal of the Emperor's vision that has ever occurred. These radical views are, of course, extremely dangerous and extremely rare. Most inquisitors who develop such interpretations are quickly identified and either brought back to orthodoxy through re-education or quietly eliminated by their more conventional colleagues. But the fact that even a few inquisitors have reached such conclusions, based on testimony from Heresy-era dreadnoughts, demonstrates the potential of these ancient warriors to destabilize imperial ideology if their knowledge were to be widely disseminated. The Adeptus Ministorum, the institutional apparatus of the imperial cult, is equally concerned about Heresy-era dreadnoughts and the knowledge they carry. Cardinals and confessors understand that these ancient warriors represent a potential challenge to the Church's authority and legitimacy. If it became widely known that the Emperor explicitly rejected worship, that the imperial truth rather than the imperial creed represents his actual beliefs, the theological foundations of the Ministorum would be fatally undermined. But the Church cannot simply denounce Heresy-era dreadnoughts as unreliable or heretical. These warriors are too widely revered, their service too obviously sincere, their sacrifice too complete to be easily dismissed. Instead, the Ministorum has developed elaborate theological frameworks that attempt to reconcile the ancient warrior's testimony with current doctrine. The Emperor's rejection of his own worship is reinterpreted as a test of faith, as a means of protecting humanity from the temptations of chaos by denying them the comfort of divine protection until they were ready for such knowledge, as a strategic deception designed to prevent the dark gods from realizing the Emperor's true divine nature. These theological gymnastics are necessary because the alternative, admitting that the modern Imperium's core beliefs directly contradict the Emperor's expressed will, is unthinkable for an institution whose entire authority rests on its claim to represent the Emperor's divine mandate. So the Church does what institutions do when faced with inconvenient truths. It reinterprets, it contextualizes, it constructs elaborate frameworks that allow it to technically acknowledge reality while fundamentally denying its implications. For the Space Marine chapters themselves, the existence of Heresy-era dreadnoughts creates a peculiar form of institutional memory that both enriches and complicates their identity. These ancient warriors provide continuity with the chapter's founding, a direct link to the legions and primarchs from which they descend. They offer tactical and strategic wisdom accumulated over millennia. They serve as powerful symbols of the chapter's history and traditions. But they also represent a form of institutional conscience, a living reminder of what the chapters were meant to be, against which their current state can be measured and potentially found wanting. Some chapters embrace this role, viewing their Heresy-era dreadnoughts as valuable checks against institutional drift, as sources of perspective that can help the chapter remain true to its founding principles, even as the galaxy around it changes. These chapters periodically wake their ancient ones specifically to consult on matters of tradition and identity, asking whether proposed changes to doctrine or practice align with the chapter's original character and purpose. Other chapters resist this role, viewing their ancient warriors primarily as tactical assets and symbols, rather than as active participants in the chapter's ongoing evolution. These chapters prefer to keep their Heresy-era dreadnoughts in stasis as much as possible, minimizing their exposure to how much the chapter has changed, avoiding the difficult conversations that might arise if the ancient ones were given opportunity to comment on the chapter's current state. And some chapters fall somewhere between these extremes, valuing their ancient warriors' perspective, but also carefully managing when and how that perspective is sought. Understanding that while continuity with the past is important, so is the chapter's need to adapt to changing circumstances and remain effective in the present. The broader question of what role Heresy-era dreadnoughts should play in shaping the Imperium's future remains unresolved. Should these ancient warriors be consulted more widely, their testimony used to correct historical errors and challenge comfortable myths? Or should they be carefully managed and restricted, their knowledge preserved, but not allowed to disrupt the stability of an Imperium that depends on certain foundational beliefs, regardless of their relationship to truth? Is the Imperium better served by historical accuracy or by maintaining useful fictions? And who has the authority to make these decisions, to determine what truths should be shared and what should be suppressed? These are not merely academic questions. In a galaxy where belief shapes reality, where the power of faith can literally manifest miracles, and where doubt can create weaknesses that chaos exploits, the relationship between truth and utility becomes genuinely complex. Perhaps the ancient warrior's testimony about the Emperor's rejection of worship is historically accurate, but does sharing that truth serve humanity's interests when faith in the Emperor's divinity is one of the few things that holds the Imperium together? Perhaps the raw facts about the traitor Primarch's legitimate grievances are true, but does acknowledging those grievances help humanity survive when absolute loyalty and unquestioning obedience are essential to the Imperium's defense? Heresy-era dreadnoughts embody this tension. They are simultaneously sources of truth and potential sources of destabilization, valuable resources and dangerous liabilities, honored relics and carefully managed threats. And the Imperium's various institutions must navigate this tension constantly, deciding case by case, moment by moment, what role these ancient witnesses should play in shaping humanity's understanding of its past and its vision for its future. The ultimate irony is that the ancient warriors themselves, these Heresy-era dreadnoughts, who have survived 10,000 years of service, who have witnessed the entire arc of the Imperium's transformation from the enlightened rationalism of the Great Crusade to the superstitious desperation of the 41st millennium, may not even care about these broader implications. After millennia of existence in the sarcophagus, after countless cycles of waking and sleeping, Many of them have lost the capacity to concern themselves with grand questions of truth and stability, historical accuracy and institutional need. They continue to serve because service is what they know, because duty is all that remains after time and trauma have stripped away everything else. They speak when asked to speak, fight when ordered to fight, sleep when returned to stasis. The question of what their testimony means, how it should be used, what implications it has for the Imperium's future. These are concerns for those who still have the luxury of caring about such things, who still possess the fullness of human consciousness necessary to engage with abstract questions of meaning and purpose. The ancient ones themselves exist in a simpler, more immediate reality. Wake, fight, sleep, remember, forget, continue, endure, until finally, if they are fortunate, an enemy's weapon penetrates the armor and brings the mercy of true death, releasing them from a service that has stretched across 10 millennia and a burden that no living being was meant to bear. Conclusion. When a dreadnought who witnessed the Horus Heresy finally speaks, his words carry the weight of 10,000 years of history, lived experience that spans from the bright optimism of the Great Crusade through the devastating betrayal of the Heresy to the grim darkness of the 41st Millennium. He is a living bridge between ages, a consciousness that has endured when it should have died, preserved not out of mercy, but because his knowledge is deemed too valuable to lose and his service too necessary to forego. The testimony these ancient warriors provide is carefully managed, filtered through layers of institutional mediation, shaped to serve the needs of the present rather than simply reflecting the truth of the past. What they remember about the Emperor, about the Primarchs, about the causes and conduct of the heresy, often contradicts the comfortable myths that the modern Imperium requires to maintain its stability. And so their words are contextualized, reinterpreted, sometimes suppressed, transformed from raw historical truth into something that can coexist with the theological and political orthodoxies that define the 41st millennium. But beneath all this careful management, beneath the rituals and protocols and theological frameworks, the truth remains. These ancient warriors remember when the Imperium was different, when humanity aspired to something more than mere survival, when the Emperor walked among his subjects as a man rather than being worshipped as a god. They remember when the galaxy seemed conquerable, when the future appeared bright, when the great project of reunifying humanity and reclaiming the stars felt not just possible, but inevitable. They remember the moment when all of it came crashing down, when brother turned on brother, and the dream died in fire and betrayal. They remember the heresy not as ancient history, but as lived trauma, a wound that has never truly healed despite 10,000 years of attempted recovery. They carry within their scarred consciousness the knowledge of what humanity has lost, what it might have been, what it still could be, if only it could overcome the weight of its own history and the inertia of its accumulated mistakes. This knowledge is their gift and their curse, the reason they are revered and the reason they are carefully controlled, the source of their value and the root of their suffering. They are witnesses to truth in an age that often cannot afford truth, repositories of history in an era that requires myth, voices from a better time speaking to an age that can barely comprehend what that better time was like. And so they continue, waking and sleeping, fighting and remembering, serving and enduring, until finally the mercy of true death releases them from a burden that no one should have to bear, but that someone must carry if the Imperium is to maintain any connection at all to its founding vision and its original purpose. In the end, perhaps that is the real significance of these heresy-era dreadnoughts. Not the specific facts they remember or the tactical wisdom they provide, but simply their existence itself, proof that the connection to the past has not been completely severed, that somewhere in the depths of fortress monasteries across the galaxy, warriors who remember what the Imperium was meant to be still draw breath, still serve, still hope that perhaps, someday, humanity might reclaim at least some of what it has lost. Until then, they wait in the darkness of stasis, dreaming dreams that are not dreams, existing in a state between life and death, ready to wake when called, to speak when asked, to fight when needed, carrying forward a legacy that spans 10,000 years and a truth that the Imperium both treasures and fears. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lives and testimonies of Heresy-era dreadnoughts, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps make videos like this possible. What aspect of Warhammer 40,000 lore would you like to see covered next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. Until next time, for the Emperor.